Part of what you're watching with the Trump administration can be, and in my judgment, ought to be, understood as a war on the working class at home, but also abroad. Uh, what is being done? Let me start at the opposite end. What is being done in Europe is remarkable. A deal that came out of World War II, in which the United States would defeat the new enemy, the Soviet Union, barely a few months after being the great ally. It became overnight the great enemy, showing a kind of flexibility which is at once astonishing, but also impressive in terms of meeting your own needs and rearranging the pieces on the board that you're playing with. The deal that was made was the following. We, the United States, we have two big worries right now. Number one, the New Deal. An awful lot of money was taxed or borrowed from rich corporations and the wealthy people to provide a remarkable array of mass services: unemployment insurance, a minimum wage, the Social Security system, government employment. This had to be rolled back. And as you know very well, our last 50 years are the story of the rollback of that New Deal. But it also required smashing the socialists and communists who had created that New Deal with their alliance for a while with the Democratic Party. All of that had to be undone and was undone. The second great anxiety at the end of the war was that we would fall back into a depression. Let's remember, it was only the war that finally got us out of the horrible collapse of capitalism, the worst in its history, from 1929 to 1940-41. And only by taking the remaining many, many millions of people, I'm going to be simple now, putting half of them in uniform and the other half making the uniforms, we were able. And then the great worry, and it was very serious, at the end of the war, 45, what would now happen? We would demobilize all these people out of the military, out of producing for the military. What would prevent us from slipping back? And you can see the government did extraordinary things. The GI Bill, to take all those soldiers and instead of having them go into the unemployment, stick them in a university where the government would pay for it. The housing program, the highway program, all of them. But what people don't recognize was that there was another part of this, and that was the international part with Europe. The problem was Europe had the same depression history as this country did. And during that time, as in the United States, socialist and communist parties became much stronger than they had ever been in Europe. So at the end of the war, you had the worry about slipping back, but you had an even bigger one, that you had very strong socialist and communist parties who had led the movement of the 1930s to get social services, which were much more generous in Europe than they were in this country. Plus, the socialists and communists provided the militants who were the anti-fascist resistance. So they were popular, they were strong. De Gaulle's first government after 45 had to have Communist Party people in the cabinet. For Italy, the second biggest party in the 20 years after the war was the Italian Communist Party, and I could go on. And they all had the Soviet Union literally a few hours by train from them. So their capitalist classes were even more freaked out about what was going on. And then the alliance with the Soviet Union, it was all too much. So what the United States did is cut a deal. We will solve our economic problem by putting Keynesianism on steroids. The government is going to come in and do what? Save us from the Soviet menace, build up the military industrial, and say to the Europeans, we'll take care of it. We'll provide you with the defense umbrella, we'll provide you with all the support, and all you have to do is make sure you crush the socialists and communists at home, and you are a good bulwark against the Soviet Union. And to that end, here's what we're going to do. You won't have to cover defense. We're taking care of that with our domestic Keynesian, military Keynesianism. And you're going to take the money you would have had to spend to provide the social services that will allow you to compete with what the Russians are offering their people, and had been already for quite a while at that time. So you're going to compete with them, and then we're going to take our National Endowment for Democracy, our CIA, and all the rest, and make sure the right politicians willing to commit to this deal sit at the top of the government in France, in Germany, in Britain, and we all know the story of all of the money and the sloshing that was done. That was it. That was the way we were going to destroy the socialist and communist inside and weaken or destroy, if we could, the one outside, and all of it justifying the massive government spending. But the problem is, all of that was paid for, to touch on your point, by debt. The United States does not like to fight wars with taxes. It likes to fight wars with money borrowed. Because if you tax the people, the opposition to the war would be much bigger and arise much sooner. So you can't do that. You borrow the money. Here's the irony. The Europeans were major lenders for a while to the United States to fund the Keynesianism that protected them from having to use their money for their own defense. The ironies of how this all fit together are a charming story that's never quite been put down on paper. What we have now is the collapse of that deal. It's very important historically, and I know you do the history too, Chris, something we have in common, which I think is part of whatever effect we have. The story, it fits together our situation coming out of World War II and working out this way for another lease on life with lots of domestic government spending. But the problem is, so much of it was done on debt. And so much of it was done without understanding of the special moment. The United States had no competitor coming out of World War II. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, they were all destroyed. We came out king of the hill. Our economy was in better shape coming out of the war than it was going in, and no one else could say that. And the result was a very bizarre, unique, special moment that could not possibly last. I think historians will look back, be rather impressed it lasted as long as it did. But in any case, it is now over. You can't do it. The United States lost the war in Vietnam. It lost it in Iraq. It's losing it in Ukraine. I mean, look at it. And these are among the poorest countries on earth to which the U.S. is losing. And the Europeans are left in a way one almost has to sympathize. They're irrelevant. They've become not the literal opposite of what they were 3 or 4 centuries ago. The center of the universe, the apogee of culture, the colonial master, all of that. It's all gone. Europe is a footnote, living in a world of fantasy where, being unable to stop the Russians with the United States, they actually think that they're going to do it without the United States. I mean, these are levels of craziness that are part of the decline, I suspect, of all empires when they consume themselves. Last point. I am particularly struck with this crazy business of attacking federal employees in the name of efficiency. That is so laughable that one has to kind of take a deep breath, because it's sort of overwhelming what you get here. 2.5 million civilian employees of the federal government versus 5 million working for state government and 15 million working for the local government. If you cared a damn about efficiency, or whatever that exactly means, Your obvious targets would be local and state, but they can't get at those, so they go after the federal. That's not a decision of efficiency. That's a decision of where can we make a public performance, and they're making a public performance. It ruins the lives of those people. It destroys whatever function these agencies often had. It drives people entering the labor force, which is a larger number than those leaving the federal. They're all going to go into the private sector where they're going to bid down wages. At the same time that they can't control the inflation, you're ripping up your working class more and more and more, as if there were no end to this process. These are the desperate behaviors of a dying empire. There's really no other framework that I can think of that makes sense of this.
Well, aren't they trying to essentially destroy government agencies like the Postal Service, for instance, education, because they privatize it? They make money off it.
They live in a world. Look, I'm part of it. I've been a professor of economics all my life. I grew up in that framework. I had to learn all of that. I had to teach it often. They live in a framework governed by the theory of economics, their theory, which says that, and I mean this as blunt and as religious sounding in the negative sense of the term as I can make it. They live in a world in which whatever the private sector does is efficient, more so than any other way of getting the job done. And anything that you can do to reduce the economic footprint of the government, thereby shifting the work over to the private sector, will be an increase in efficiency from which all of us will benefit. They actually believe. It's like listening to a plantation owner in Louisiana in 1832 explaining how and why master and slave is the best possible arrangement for the human race to accomplish what it needs to produce. It's so obvious, it's just beyond needing to be explained. Yeah, you have these people. It's a small business mentality. I can do it. I'm doing it real well. If only the government rules and regulations weren't there, and if all the bad people that intervene in the free market, which is our modern religious icon, well then, yeah, they actually, to the degree that they are governed by any theoretical awareness at all, it is a simple-minded version of that simplistic mantra, which, you and I know, I went to the fanciest schools this country has, and that's what they taught us.
But it's dynamiting the very foundations that makes a capitalist system work. The infrastructure's collapsing. You don't educate your population. We see what a privatized social service, postal service has done in England. It's a mess. It doesn't work. From that introduction, aren't they, perhaps unwittingly, aren't they actually destroying the very structures that makes the accumulation of wealth in the long term possible?
Here's the way I understand it. They had that ideology, the private sector is the efficient, they've been believing that for 200 years, if not longer. It has many names: liberalism, neoliberalism, laissez-faire, lots of language for the same basic idea. But they were always, and this is the way I understand it, they were always counteracted to some extent by sort of practical men and women who said to them, wait a minute, yeah, maybe, but if we don't solve this problem real quick, and the only agency that's going to do that is the government, we are going to be in deep trouble. Right? We turn to the government to run the military when we're attacked because the private isn't quite. And then they will make a break. They will do what Roosevelt ended up doing in the 1930s. They'll intervene in the labor market. There's a minimum wage. We don't care what market forces are. You don't go below that. And I want to remind people, even the conservatives had those. When the inflation was unmanageable in 1971, Nixon goes on the radio and television, 15th of August, 1971, and says, I am freezing all wages and prices in the United States. As of tomorrow morning, if you raise your price, Mr. Businessman, we're going to arrest you, and you're going to jail. Whoa. Okay, this is a kind of recognition. If you have the space, what we have now is a population increasingly persuaded, right up to the top, that there is no space. You can't afford the apparent solution of the government. You've got to do something. And the only thing they can think of, given the narrowness of our education, is that fantasy. They're going to save America by going backwards. What in the world is that? Go back to what? Whatever it is that got you here. I mean, it's nuts. And what they're doing is they're living out the fantasy. I would guess in other empires, as they declined, they began to appeal to their gods, to their fetishes, to their fantasies, because they had nothing practically workable left. We are borrowed up to here with our $35 trillion of national debt. It's way above our national GDP, which is not supposed to be. That used to be considered a no-no line. Our European allies don't do it as badly as we do it, although they're about to. Look at the Germans. There's a losing of your mind. Mr. Merz became the new, about to become chancellor there. He ran a campaign on preserving the German commitment to no government borrowing. Within days of the election, he completely reverses himself and now champions the biggest debt expansion in German history to build a military. Who's he going to fight? The Russians? That's a joke. The Chinese? That's a bigger joke. The United States? Perhaps the biggest joke of all. What? The only people he could use that for are the other Europeans. And I think somewhere we've seen that picture before. These are behaviors that people like you and me and others in the media are going to have a harder and harder time nailing down, because they are the desperate acts of a declining empire that doesn't know where to turn.